Hello, historians. We are talking today about native Arizonans. And as always, I am your host, Dr. Summer Sherland. So here's today's challenge. You are going to watch the lecture. You're going to select one of the three ancient Arizona civilizations that I discussed to study. So there will be four discussed, but there's three that are an option, and I'll discuss those in a moment. You're going to pick one of those three. Then you're going to research using only library resources. So you have to use the library. You can't just Google. You need to look in the library to find materials for this particular challenge. And you're going to find the following things: one image that is relevant to your chosen civilization, one article that is about this civilization from a Eurocentric point of view, and one article that challenges that Eurocentric viewpoint, preferably emphasizing the native group you've chosen, their perspective. And then you're going to share your findings with the group. So that's your challenge today. I will introduce you to all of these topics. I'm going to talk about Eurocentrism. I'm going to discuss different native Arizonans and ancient Arizonans, and we're going to go from there. Okay? Here are some terms to know. You can research these before you watch the lecture or as you're watching the lecture, or you can wait while I'm talking and try to define them based on what I share with you. So these are some things that are going to come up in today's talk. Pre-Columbian and prehistoric. What do those terms mean? Eurocentric, Clovis, ancestral Pueblo, Hohokam/Huhugam, and Mogollon. Those are your terms that you're going to need to know today. So I'm just going to start real quick with pre-Columbian and prehistoric. So when you're in a history class, or maybe an anthropology class, a geology class, a geography class, you might see these terms pretty regularly. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. So pre-Columbian is typically the one I use because it refers to America before Columbus, right? And his sort of famed expeditions of the late 15th century. So everything that before Columbus and European arrival to the North American continent, we call that pre-Columbian. Now, we don't use the term prehistoric as much, and this is because, well, I don't, this is because prehistoric generally refers to things that are before written history. So prehistory, right? The recorded record. Well, what we've found over the years is, of course, is that some ancient peoples may have not left, written documents about their histories, but they left oral testimony and tradition. They passed down stories. They also left behind cave markings and pottery. So you might see those terms used interchangeably. You might also see them distinguished a little bit more, but typically I'm going to use pre-Columbian because it gives us a little bit more of an assumption of kind of what I'm talking about. So let's discuss the term Eurocentric. Just look for a moment at this term, at this word. What do you immediately think this word means? Eurocentric is focusing on European culture or history to the exclusion of a wider view of the world, implicitly regarding European culture as central or preeminent. So that's why I appreciate the pre-Columbian use of that. I appreciate the use of the term pre-Columbian because we're referencing a moment in time. We're not saying prehistory. Everything that happened before the arrival of a European was before history was ever recorded. Does that make sense? So today you're really going to be investigating. We're going to talk about the history of different groups in ancient Arizona or in pre-Columbian Arizona, but we're really trying to look at, is this a framework that is putting Europe at the center and white people at the center and European people at the center? Or is this a viewpoint that really looks holistically or perhaps reshapes the entire perspective to be more from a native perspective? These are things you're going to be looking for today for your assignment. A couple other terms you're going to see me use. Now, this is a complicated chart. It's a complex way of understanding, but you're going to see in your study of history in general, the terms BC or BCE used often, especially when we're talking about kind of prehistoric or pre-Columbian history. You're also going to kind of see these letters AD or CE denoted, and they're basically the same, right? They're basically the same. One is less spiritual based and one is a little bit more secular. So BC stands for before Christ, indicating that the presumed date that Christ was born is year zero. So everything that happened before year zero is considered BC, before Christ. Everything that happened AD is Anno Domini, or Anno Domini, right? So anything that happened after year zero. Some people think after death, but the assumption is that Jesus Christ would have lived for around 30 years. And so where would those other 30 years go? So that is kind of not why AD, it doesn't mean after death, but it doesn't really matter when it comes to our particular study. You might see a more sort of secular use, right? So BC and AD are, a centuries old terminology. Before Common Era is also used interchangeably with BC. It just references that the year zero happened, and before that, it was before Common Era. And then anything after the year zero is Common Era. So it really removes kind of the religious or spiritual component. There's a couple other differences, but basically those are sort of the distinctions. I use them all. I use all four. And I don't really test you or quiz you on either of these terms. You don't need to know this in a way that is you're not going to be quizzed on it, but it helps you to understand what we're talking about, right? The reason I use them interchangeably is I just use whatever source material that whatever they use, I use their kind of sequencing. It just makes it easier for me. I don't have to make a claim either way, right? I'm just saying, well, this author used BC, I'm going to use BC. This author used CE, I'm going to use CE. Okay. All right, so pre-Columbian contact. What was America and Arizona specifically, Southwest, like before Columbus' arrival in the late 15th century? So Tom Sheridan, who I reference often and wrote the book Arizona, let me show you what it looks like. Sometimes I assign this book in my class. Sometimes we use library resources, but this book, as you can see, is heavily dog-eared. It's one of the best books on the history of Arizona. I encourage you to get it if you don't already have it. He wrote in this book, quote, "Our knowledge of the pre-Columbian past reflects a series of orthodoxies that slowly crumble through a patient accumulation of evidence." That's that idea, right? This idea that the Eurocentric viewpoint is the one that has been sort of widely accepted as truth. But the more that you chip away at it, the more you begin to really compare things with evidence, that meta-narrative gets challenged on the regular. So here's a great example. This is called the Clovis first hypothesis. So the Clovis first hypothesis is the belief that the first people to arrive in the Americas showed up as soon as they could cross the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into modern day Alaska, parts of Canada, and then they moved down into the Southwest through a long, steady stream of migration. That's basically the Clovis first hypothesis. So these are the first humans in the Americas. They were so-called Paleo-Indians, right? This is a quote from Sheridan. They used, you can see at the very bottom, the way they were identified was the first point, right? There's the first archaeological finding that scientists had and archaeologists had was near a place called Clovis, New Mexico. So that's why they're called the Clovis people. And what those archaeologists found were these stone spear points. So you can see at the bottom, kind of like arrowheads, right? Or just a little piece of stone that has been carved or chiseled into a point that you could then use as a weapon or a hunting tool. Historians believe these are small bands, so small groups, not large civilizations of people, but smaller groups of big game hunters. So they hunted like woolly mammoth type animals, you know what I mean? So historians believe they crossed Beringia, the Siberian land bridge, circa about 10,000 BC. So 10,000 years before the Common Era. And then what happened was that they fanned out across North America. And all Clovis sites point to this particular year, right around, not particular year, particular era, around 9,000 BC. This is the belief of how people first arrived in the Americas. This is the hypothesis, right? Okay, sounds good. But Clovis first has been challenged, and here's how. This might interest you if you're kind of a forensic person, right? You like looking at sort of DNA type things. Historians begin asking, but what about Monteverde, which is a location 500 miles south of Santiago, Chile? where bone and charcoal that could be dated about 550 years before those first Clovis spear points had been found. So what about those folks? Like, how would we know, how would we believe the Clovis were first and that they came across Beringia if 500 years before that, there were people south of Santiago, Chile? That's very far south, right? That's about 1,000 years, or around 500 to 1,000 years before Clovis. What about travel by boat? Why would we assume that these people only walked and traveled by foot? And what happens if we start to think about trace material, tools, trash, right, that they left behind? If we all of a sudden stop picturing them as migrants and think of them like walking migrants and think of them as ocean, like on the ocean, like they're dropping their trash, they're dropping things into the ocean instead of leaving them behind on land for us to find. And this is interesting. So the Pacific coast was free of ice, because this is a cooling or a warming period, was free of ice by 12,500 BC. Something that is noted is that 9 different species of marine algae have been found near Monteverde, which scientists believe is the potential diet of the original people who arrived in South America. And they call this the kelp highway from Japan to the Andean coast of South America. So through kelp, we can see that similar strains of edible seaweed basically can be traced all along that western coast of South America and along the eastern coast of Japan. And then this is the last one that kind of comes up, and this becomes more and more relevant as the 20th century comes to an end. What about human excrement, right? One of the ways that scientists were able to start testing the theories of the Clovis first was that they were testing materials left behind, including human waste, believe it or not. And DNA profiling demonstrated that non-related humans, so people who were not related to each other at all, were in the Americas earlier or at the same time as the Clovis people. So we know the Clovis people were here, around 10,000 BC. And yet we know another group is also here in the Americas around that same time, and maybe even earlier. So here's a quote from one of the researchers out of Copenhagen who did a study on this. He said, the dissimilar stone artifacts, as well as the DNA profiling of the human excrement, show that humans were present before Clovis, and that another culture in North America is at least as old as the Clovis culture itself. Or, to put it differently, he writes, either America was populated several thousand years before Clovis by people who created, quote, mother technologies to the very different styles of Clovis tools and Western stemmed tradition tools. Or, so that's option one, there were people here who created the tools in the first place and kind of innovated. Or there were 2 earlier migrations into North America, of which one would have predated the Clovis immigration by about 1,000 years. So if you've seen those maps of like human beings arriving in the Americas through this migration across Beringia, you might see other people saying, actually, we can debunk that, we can challenge that through the tracing of human DNA, basically. All of that is still fairly Eurocentric, right? All of that believes that anyone who was in America by the time of Columbian contact or European contact, that they arrived from somewhere else, right? That they were migrants from the beginning. That's the theory, right? Regardless of if you look at the kelp highway and the possibility of people arriving by boats, or you think of the migration of walking humans, whichever one, you're assuming that that's a migration story. But native Arizonans and ancient Arizonans never claimed to be from anywhere else but where they already were. And in fact, if you look at native creation stories or native migration stories, many of them actually originate their entire being, their entire culture in their southwestern location. So some groups, for example, believe that they originated in the Grand Canyon. Some believe they originated in other places throughout the Southwest. This is a much more sort of creation story, that the emergence of human beings came from the land itself, not that human beings arrived from somewhere else. So one of the things, if you're looking for a good example of sources to compare, right, a Eurocentric source and a native source possibly, or a challenging source, You might say, I'm going to look for a source that discusses human migration into the Americas, and then you're going to contrast it with a source that tells the story of the Navajo or Hopi or other such organization that's near the Southwest or Arizona that tells a creation story that they emerged from the location here itself. So who were these pre-Columbian people? Now, I said you could study one of three organizations or three civilizations. These are your three. So no, you don't focus on the Clovis. You're going to focus on one of these three groups. So who were they? Sheridan writes, because of their dependence on scattered and seasonal resources, archaic groups did not occupy permanent settlements. Instead, they traveled from camp to camp in search of water and wild foods. So I'm going to tell you about three different groups. I'm going to do my best to give you kind of an idea of their geographical location, the time in question, what happened to them, right? But also know that some of these things are scattered to history because people were very migratory at the time, but not always. So the very first Arizonans in general, all three of these civilizations fall within this umbrella, occurred basically during the Archaic period. Their peak years were during the Archaic period. That's about 8500 BC to 200 AD. So if we're in the 21st century, for example, that would have been the first century, 200 AD. So that would be, 2000 years ago or so. So the Archaic period is before the Common Era, and 200 is after. They hunted big and small game. They foraged. They use a variety of tools, and this indicates that they moved around a lot and adapted to their surroundings. They were impacted by dramatic climate change. So for example, the Sonoran Desert, where we live, was populated with pinyon, juniper, and oak woodlands long before it was a desert, the one that we know of. And those ponderosa pines, those really tall pine trees that existed on the Colorado Plateau, they weren't there yet. That's how old we're talking, right? Those pine trees are hundreds of years old, and they were not there yet before the people that we're discussing today. Temperatures rose over time and precipitation changed, making Arizona much more arid, and this affected vegetation and water. And so most of their survival did rely on seasonal migration. And there are some exceptions, which you'll see in a moment. So as you're learning about these three organizations or these three civilizations, start to consider which of these interests you the most and what would you like to learn more about. So what we know for sure is all three groups were fairly transitional. They adopted, even if they moved around a lot, they adopted something that Sheridan calls plant husbandry. So like cultivating specific crops, even though they were moving around. So they may not have laid out these like large farms that you might be thinking of, at least in the beginning, but they still intentionally planted seeds places, or they still intentionally pruned or gathered certain things, knowing about the seasonal cycles. We know irrigation doesn't happen until much later on. Irrigation, the drawing of water from rivers, etc. This happened around 300 BC. Now that's getting closer and closer to zero, right? So we know that's getting closer to the modern or common era. They either did this abruptly. It either happened like very quickly and they would just start drawing out water from a river, or they would move slowly from one river system to the next. Around 1500 BC, we see, this is something interesting. This particular image is from a canal system near Tucson. We actually see really innovative canal systems that were drawn into the land. So southwestern canals that were developed at the same time or earlier than those in Mesoamerica. So remember I said, like, as we get closer to BC, as we get closer to that common era, this is when they're kind of moving around. But if you go back in time, if you go even further back, you start to see that canal irrigation was actually developed around the same time, if not earlier than the Roman Empire. Okay, I hope that wasn't confusing, but if it is, let me know. So one thing to mention is that the Roman aqueducts, the ones that are most famous in the world, these occurred even later, right? 312 BCE to about 226 CE. So there's some overlap, but it's important to know that the canal systems that were existing in prehistoric Arizona or pre-Columbian Arizona were not influenced by what was happening in Rome, right? It wasn't as though the Europeans arrived and taught Native people all these innovations. These things existed before European arrival. Oops. So early agriculture in the Southwest. So maize, right? Corn, which is probably the most famous American crop. This preceded irrigation. So that's how we know that there was plant husbandry, was that people were able to cultivate crops like corn before there's evidence of controlling water. Squash and gourds were even older than that. So squash and gourds preceded maize, 6,000 to 8,000 BC. We have evidence that those are the earliest crops that were grown here in the Arizona area. Also beans and agave. And all of these things did rely on either river water, irrigation, or some form of storage. So pretty fascinating if you think about like what we need these days to accomplish any task. These folks were creating all of this stuff without even a garden hose, right? They were able to cultivate enough food to live off of on their own while they were also migratory. So here are your three civilizations. I promised I would get to them. Here they are, right? You can choose from the ancestral Pueblo, the Huhugam, or the Mogollon. So let's start with the ancestral Pueblo. You may also see them referred to as the Anasazi. This is not the term that is used anymore, but you might see it in the historical record, or as you're doing research in the library, you might use that term too, because that could be a Eurocentric approach, right? So they were also called Anasazi, but now they're referred to as the ancestral Pueblo. They mostly lived on the Colorado Plateau, and this ranged from the Rio Grande Valley to the Grand Canyon. So remember your map, they were up higher up on the Colorado Plateau. Originally, and all three of these groups have this in common, but originally they lived in sort of not underground, but like semi-subterranean. They might build pit houses into the side of a mountain or a hill, and then they eventually moved to a surface dwelling. Their whole lives, we believe, were kind of dominated by spirituality and religion. This linked families, clans, and communities. And the way that archaeologists have traced this is through rock art, kiva murals, and oral tradition. So even though, like I said, there's no like book written, there's no documents that were survived, but we were able to discern this through oral histories and oral testimony. Now, this is a sensitive comment. So this is what Sheridan writes. They're the only pre-Hispanic group who indisputably left behind modern descendants. Now, this does not mean they're the only ones who did. It means that archaeologists can directly trace through DNA and through other types of bone testing, things like that. They're able to test and note that there is evidence of current living people who can tie their lineage all the way back to the ancestral Pueblos. Now, that's not the case with the other two organizations and civilizations that we study, but it doesn't mean it's not true. It just means it hasn't been proven. They were semi-permanent, so we can see this through dwellings that we can still visit today, like this here, the photo of Canyon de Chelly. All right, here's their timeline. So let's talk about when they were around. So there's regional differences about this. It's about 600 BC and 500 AD are when we think we can trace their origins. Around 200 AD is when pottery was introduced, or at least evidence of such. Around 500 AD, we begin to see differences in pottery, like regionally. So some that might be further north might have one kind of pottery, other groups that are a little bit further south. Around the year 1000, then we begin to see regional differences in dwellings. So they begin to diversify based on their environment. We would call the peak of the ancestral Pueblo between 1000 to the year 1150. This is when they were at their highest in terms of population. They were conducting the most farming, hunting, irrigation, major construction projects, and we believe their communities were most powerful. But then things change. Around 1276 to 1299, geologists have found there was a great drought that truly desiccated the entire Colorado Plateau. And we know that around the year 1300, most major most major communities or construction projects were abandoned. So either these groups dispersed or they started living a little bit more migratory. They kind of reverted back to a migratory way of life. Let's talk about the Huhugam now. Now, you may also see them referred to as the Hohokam. So if you hear the word Hohokam, What that is a European interpretation of a word meaning vanished or disappeared. Whereas huhugam is a more inclusive term to mean those who are among us, right? Those who are still among us. These folks were masters of irrigation. They dug the first canals. So when you're riding your bike or you're walking across campus or you're driving, whatever, and you see one of those canals that's bringing water to Phoenix and electricity to Phoenix, Americans were not the first to do this, right? Centuries before the Hohokam were the ones doing this. They were incredible, and they lived here in the Salt River Valley, so right here in the area of Phoenix. But there's evidence of them across the Southwest from about Santa Cruz Basin to the Verde Valley. So they were all along the middle of our current state. They left behind some interesting evidence of construction, I suppose. They left behind these ball courts and mounds, which historians believe were places for feasting, for celebration, ritual, trading. They were kind of the center of civilization. We know that through their irrigation, they created kind of communities that were interconnected. So they may not have been, the theory is that they may not have been like a huge empire at some point, but they might have just been like interconnected villages along the canal. And the individual communities would have been between 25 or 2,300 people to about no more than 6,500 or 5,800 or so. They were farmers, but they also used wild resources. So they didn't just create crops. They also moved around. They ate or gathered mesquite pods, saguaro fruit, cholla buds, leaves, and grasses. They also hunted. They hunted deer and bighorn sheep, jackrabbits, and rodents. When the Salt River regularly flooded until about 1911. We will talk about that as a class later. So the floods typically threatened their canals, as well did over civilization. So these were kind of the threats to the Huhugam. And I mentioned the Salt River. They typically irrigated either the Salt River or the Gila River. Here's our timeline. It's a little bit less clear, and that might be because of that sort of lack of direct lineage that we can trace. So we believe their peak years were around the year 750 to about 1150 AD. And then we think around that time, there's about 100-year period that there were a series of chiefdoms, right? So like pretty clear hierarchical organization. And then right around, you'll see different years for this, but I'm using Sheridan's timeline. Right around the year 1200 is when the Hohokam is kind of lost to history or interpretation. So we don't have a ton of evidence about what happens after the year about 1200. Now, Spanish arrival doesn't come until 1492, and even then, that's way south and east from Arizona. So truly, it's not until the 16th century that Europeans arrive in Arizona, and the Hohokam are long gone by that point. So where did they go? What happened to them? It really is up to interpretation. And if you're interested in that, perhaps that's something you decide to research this week. All right, finally, the Mogollon. Now, the Mogollon were consolidated mostly in the mountains and deserts of southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico. This is later called Apacheria when the Apache tribe claimed this area. They also had pit houses, cave dwellings, and high mesa settlements. We believe they lived on small scale irrigation, so not those like large community-wide canals that the Hohokam were known for, kind of more runoff farming, maybe little ditches here and there. We believe, some people believe, historians believe that the ancestral Pueblos may have eventually assimilated the northern Mogollon people. This is disputed depending on what side of or what perspective you're interested in, but this is one of the claims, right? Groups to the south, on the other hand, maintain their own distinct identity. So it's possible that the Mogollon people kind of fractured based on region. One group became adopted sort of by the ancestral Pueblo and integrated into that culture, and the other was a little bit more distinct. Now they're known for their incredible pottery and intricate designs of pottery. And here's their timeline. So all of these groups you can see left behind some form of archaeological evidence. Around 200 AD is when we're first able to trace them to a semi-sedentary lifestyle. And then in 750 in the year 750, we see a growth in population among the Mogollon. Around the year 1000, right around that same time that the Hohokam, there's a question about what happens to them. The Mogollon have a residential transition from pit houses to above ground pueblos. But look at that, only 150 years later, it's a pretty evident decline. So what happened to all of these groups, right? You might be thinking any one of these things that might be interesting to you, right? What happened to this group? Why were they so prominent? Why were they so powerful? Did they have any, like, who did they go to war with each other? Like, did they trade with each other? Like, what kinds of questions might you be having? Because that's going to help you with your challenge today. Here's just some general patterns among native Arizonans. And you can see now from this map sort of where we think the Mogollon were, the Hohokam or the Hugam, and the ancestral Pueblo. So these were parallel developments. They were happening at the same time. We know for sure all three groups were remarkable when it came to organization of civilization, construction, and irrigation or water, right? They all experienced climate change. It happened all for all of them. Around the year 1020 to 1160 AD, we see just a series of destructive floods throughout the Salt River Valley. We know people clash. We know human nature says that they would be competing for scarce resources. They would be trading, but there also might be warfare, violence with and among groups. We also know there might be migration happening, or there might be a concept of assimilation, so or kinship, like the bringing in of outsiders to one's group. So reminder, today's challenge, you've watched the lecture, way to go. You're going to select one of those three, ancestral Pueblo, Hohokam, or Mogollon. You don't have to do all three, just one. And you're going to research using only library resources. I want you to find an image of your organization or your civilization, an article that is about the Eurocentric viewpoint, and an article that challenges a Eurocentric viewpoint. I'd be very happy if you find a Native American perspective on your group. That may be difficult to find, so as long as you're looking for something that challenges the Eurocentric viewpoint, you're good. Share your findings with the group and cite your sources correctly. Now you might be wondering, Dr. C, do you prefer MLA or APA? Actually don't care as long as you use one or the other. And remember that all correct citations need four things. They need the date, they need the location, they need the author, and they need the title. So the URL is the location. If you just copy and paste a URL, you've given me nothing. I need the other three things, okay? All right, feel free to let me know if you need some help. Here's how you're gonna format the post, and I'm also gonna show you my example. So source one, you're gonna cite your source, and you're gonna briefly describe what source one claims and identify if it is Eurocentric or an alternative viewpoint. Then you'll include a citation of how you found that source. Source two, briefly describe what source, oops, that's supposed to say what source two says. Let's fix that right now before I confuse you all. All right, watch me fix it. There you go. Okay, for source two, you're gonna do the exact same thing. Source two, briefly describe what source two claims and identify if it is Eurocentric or the alternative viewpoint. Include a citation. And then finally, you're going to embed, don't attach. I don't want to have to click on something to download something to my computer. I want everybody to be able to scroll through the discussion and see each other's pictures. So embed, do not attach your image. Include a citation and how you found it. I'm going to show you my example. Dr. C's example about the Clovis theory. Now you don't get to study the Clovis, I did. So here's what I did. Source one, and you can see on the left, I cited it, is a short introduction to America before the year 1600, including a brief description of the Clovis people as the, quote, first people who came to America during the Stone Age. I believe this is Eurocentric, so I just put that in parentheses. That's good enough, right? Then I cited the source, and I found this source in the U.S. History Gale and Context database. Source two, these researchers argue that actually well-preserved ancient tools were found in Oregon caves. When tested, human DNA was found on these tools, and this DNA is older than and not connected to the first Clovis tools discovered. And I say this challenges the Eurocentric viewpoint. And then I cite my sources. And then I tell you, I found this source using the library's one search. I just went to the library, I typed in Clovis first and scrolled through my results. And then finally, this is my image. And all I did was embed the image in my slide, and I just copied and pasted the citation at the bottom. So this is the title of the image, and all of that information is included here. Clovis spear points, which for many years were thought to be artifacts from the earliest period of ... And this is found in Early Civilizations in the Americas Reference Library. And here's your editor. And I found this source by, again, using US History Galen context, and I just filtered for images. If you need help, I actually have a tutorial video later on in the assignment, not in this lecture, but further below, you'll be able to see kind of how I did this research in real time. Okay. These are my resources, as you can see. I cited author, title, location, date. Again, author, title, location, and date. Got it? All right, everybody. Good luck. I'll pull up the last slide again, today's challenge. If you need any help, reach out to me, and I look forward to seeing what you had to say. Bye.